April 1945. The morning mist hung low over the muddy roads of southern Germany as a transport convoy rolled slowly through the devastated countryside toward a processing camp in Bavaria. The landscape bore the scars of the final months of conflict. Burned-out vehicles lined the roadsides, their metal skeletons rust-red against the pale grass. Villages stood empty, their windows dark and hollow. The spring air, which should have been filled with the sounds of renewal and growth, instead carried the acrid smell of smoke and the oppressive silence of abandonment. Inside one of the covered trucks, 17 women sat in tense silence, their faces marked by exhaustion and fear. They were auxiliaries from the German military communications services, now prisoners facing an uncertain fate in the hands of the victorious Allied forces. Most were young, ranging from 18 to 26 years old. Some had joined the auxiliary services voluntarily in the early years when patriotic fervor ran high and service seemed like an adventure. Others had been conscripted more recently as the German military grew desperate for personnel to fill support roles. Now, with their nation defeated and their world shattered, they huddled together in the back of the truck, each lost in private fears about what would happen next. The American soldier assigned to guard them, Corporal James Mitchell of the 761st Tank Battalion, sat near the tailgate of the truck, his rifle resting across his knees. He was 24 years old, though the experiences of the past 3 years had aged him beyond his years. His uniform, though clean, showed the wear of hard service. The insignia on his shoulder identified his unit, one of the segregated black tank battalions that had fought its way across France and into Germany during the final year of the conflict. The women avoided his gaze, their eyes downcast or fixed on the truck's canvas cover above them. Their minds were filled with the propaganda they had been exposed to for years about what would happen if they fell into enemy hands, particularly the hands of soldiers from other races. They had been told stories designed to terrify, stories meant to keep them loyal and compliant, even as defeat became inevitable. They expected brutality, violence, and degradation. They could not have imagined that the kindness they were about to receive would come from a man whom much of America itself had refused to treat as fully human. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. What happened over the next 6 weeks would reveal a profound irony that cut to the heart of the contradictions within the Allied cause itself. A black soldier from Mississippi, who had endured systematic discrimination in his own country, would demonstrate a humanity toward former enemies that stood in stark contrast to the treatment he had received in the land he was sworn to defend. James Mitchell had grown up in the small town of Laurel, Mississippi in the 1920s and 30s. His childhood was shaped by the rigid racial hierarchy of the Jim Crow South, where black Americans were confined to separate schools, forced to use different water fountains, and barred from most public spaces that white citizens could freely enter. His father worked as a sharecropper, laboring in cotton fields under conditions that differed little from those his grandparents had endured during the days of enslavement. Young James learned early that his place in society had been predetermined by the color of his skin. Despite the limitations imposed upon him, James possessed a sharp mind and a natural leadership quality that his teachers in the segregated school recognized. He excelled in mathematics and showed remarkable problem-solving abilities. But in Mississippi during the 1930s, such talents in a black youth opened few doors. When he graduated from the 8th grade, the highest level of education available to black students in his county, his formal schooling ended. He found work in a lumber mill, earning a fraction of what white workers received for the same labor. The outbreak of conflict in Europe seemed distant and irrelevant to James and his community. They had their own battles to fight at home. But when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, everything changed. Suddenly, America needed every able-bodied man, regardless of race. James received his draft notice in March 1942, along with dozens of other young men from Laurel, both black and white. The irony was not lost on him. He was being called to fight for freedom overseas while being denied basic freedoms at home. His mother wept when he left, not just from the fear of losing her son, but from the bitter knowledge that he would be risking his life for a country that treated him as inferior. At the induction center, James and the other black recruits were immediately separated from white draftees and sent to a segregated training facility at Fort Huachuca in Arizona. The training was rigorous, but the segregation was absolute. Black soldiers trained separately, lived in separate barracks, ate in separate mess halls, and served under mostly white officers who often viewed their black troops with suspicion or outright contempt. The official military policy held that black soldiers were less capable than white soldiers, suitable only for support roles and manual labor. Combat units remained overwhelmingly white, yet James proved himself repeatedly during training. His natural aptitude for mechanics and his mathematical skills made him valuable in the maintenance and operation of the Sherman tanks that the 761st Tank Battalion would eventually crew. He was promoted to corporal, a rare achievement for a black soldier at that time. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Richard Carlson, was one of the few white officers who recognized ability regardless of color and gave James increasing responsibility. When the 761st Tank Battalion finally shipped overseas in October 1944, they had spent over 2 years in training. This was typical for black combat units. White divisions were often sent to the front after 6 months of preparation, but military leadership remained skeptical about deploying black troops in combat roles. The delay was frustrating for James and his fellow soldiers, who were eager to prove their worth. The battalion arrived in France and was attached to the 12th Army Group, supporting the advance into Germany. The winter of 1944-45 was brutal. The soldiers fought in freezing conditions, battling not just the German army but also frostbite, trench foot, and the constant cold that penetrated every layer of clothing. The Sherman tanks, never designed for such extreme weather, required constant maintenance to keep them operational. James worked around the clock, his hands raw and bleeding from handling frozen metal tools, ensuring that his unit's vehicles remained in fighting condition. Despite their exemplary service, the black soldiers of the 761st faced discrimination even at the front. They were often given the most dangerous assignments or relegated to support roles behind the lines. When they entered liberated towns, they sometimes encountered the same segregated facilities they had left behind in America. The Red Cross operated separate clubs for black and white soldiers. Local establishments that welcomed white GIs sometimes refused service to black troops. In one particularly bitter incident in February 1945, James and 3 other black soldiers entered a cafe in a small French town that had been liberated weeks earlier. They were exhausted from 3 days of continuous operations and simply wanted hot food and coffee. The proprietor refused to serve them, explaining in broken English that he served only white Americans. When they protested, white military police arrived and escorted them out, warning them not to cause trouble. That same evening, James watched from outside as German prisoners of war, captured enemy soldiers, were served meals at the same cafe before being transported to a POW camp. The message was clear. In the eyes of many, even defeated enemies were accorded more respect than black American soldiers. This was the context in which James found himself assigned to prisoner escort duty in April 1945. The German military was collapsing on all fronts. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers and auxiliaries were surrendering to Allied forces, overwhelming the prisoner processing system. Every available soldier, regardless of race, was pressed into service managing the flood of prisoners. The women in James's transport convoy were part of the Nachrichtenhelferinnen, the communications auxiliaries who had served in various capacities for the German armed forces. They had operated telephone switchboards, transmitted radio messages, and provided clerical support. Most were young, between 18 and 25 years old, and they came from all over Germany. Some were from Berlin, others from small rural villages. They had joined the auxiliary services for various reasons. Some had been motivated by patriotic fervor, others by economic necessity, and still others had simply been conscripted as the conflict dragged on and Germany grew desperate. Now, with their nation defeated and their world shattered, they faced an uncertain future. They had heard terrible stories about what happened to women prisoners, particularly in the hands of soldiers from other nations. The propaganda they had been exposed to throughout the conflict had portrayed American soldiers, and especially black American soldiers, in the most horrific terms. They expected brutality, violence, and degradation. When James first took charge of the group at a collection point near Munich, he saw the fear in their eyes. Most would not look directly at him. Some trembled visibly. One young woman, barely 20 years old, had tears streaming down her face. James understood immediately what they expected. He had seen that kind of fear before, in the faces of black citizens back home, when white authorities exercised their power without restraint. He spoke to them in the few German words he had learned, combined with gestures and a tone of voice that conveyed reassurance rather than threat. He made sure they had water for the journey. He noticed that several of the women were injured or ill, and he arranged for them to receive medical attention at the next stop. When one of the women collapsed from exhaustion during a rest break, James carried her to the shade of a tree and gave her his own ration of water until she recovered. The other American soldiers at the processing points noticed James's treatment of the prisoners and reacted in different ways. Some approved, recognizing common humanity. Others mocked him, suggesting that he was too soft or making crude jokes about his motives. A white sergeant from Tennessee confronted him directly, saying that James was showing the prisoners too much consideration. The sergeant argued that these women had served the enemy and deserved no comfort. James replied quietly but firmly. He said that he was treating them the way any human being deserved to be treated, regardless of what uniform they had worn. The sergeant sneered and walked away, but James noticed that some of the other soldiers nearby nodded in agreement with what he had said. The prisoner processing camp where James was assigned for the next 6 weeks was a hastily constructed facility surrounded by barbed wire fences. It held several thousand German prisoners, both military personnel and civilians, who had been involved in various capacities with the military administration. Conditions were basic but adequate. The prisoners had shelter, regular meals, and medical care. This was more than could be said for many of the concentration camp victims who were being liberated elsewhere in Germany, a fact that created complex emotions among Allied soldiers. James was assigned to oversee a barracks housing 200 female prisoners. His duties included organizing work details, distributing supplies, maintaining order, and ensuring that the women remained healthy until their cases could be reviewed and they could be released or transferred elsewhere. It was a position of considerable power, and the women under his supervision were entirely dependent on his goodwill. Over the first few days, James established routines that prioritized dignity and fairness. He ensured that the women had adequate bathing facilities and privacy, a consideration that surprised them given the widespread disregard for such concerns in other camps they had heard about. He personally inspected the washing area to make certain it had proper screens and that the schedule allowed sufficient time for each group. When he discovered that the water supply was insufficient, he spent an entire afternoon repairing the pump system, his hands covered in grease and grime, refusing assistance because he knew the maintenance staff would deprioritize repairs for prisoner facilities. He organized their work assignments to distribute the burden evenly, rotating the more physically demanding tasks so that no one person bore a disproportionate load. He kept careful notes in a small journal, tracking who had done which tasks and ensuring fairness over time. When some of the younger women struggled with heavy lifting, he arranged for them to take on cleaning and administrative duties instead, matching assignments to individual capabilities. He did not show favoritism based on appearance, personality, or how subservient the women acted toward him. He learned their names, all 200 of them, within the first week. This was remarkable given that most guards simply referred to prisoners by numbers or general terms. James made a point of using their proper names when addressing them, understanding instinctively that this simple act of recognition helped preserve their sense of individual identity and dignity. He made an effort to understand their individual circumstances, listening to their stories during his rounds of the barracks. He learned who had children waiting for them, who had lost family members, who was particularly worried about elderly parents or siblings. When supplies were short, which happened frequently given the chaotic conditions of the immediate post-conflict period, James shared his own rations. He would tell the women he was not hungry, though they could see the lie in his eyes. He divided his bread among those who needed it most, particularly the women who were ill or recovering from injuries. When medical supplies were inadequate, he traded cigarettes from his monthly allotment to obtain medicine for sick prisoners. Cigarettes had become a form of currency in post-conflict Germany, and James could have used them to acquire luxuries or comforts for himself. Instead, he used this valuable commodity to get antibiotics for a woman with a severe infection or bandages for another who had injured her hand during work detail. There was the case of Greta Hoffmann, a 31-year-old mother of two whose youngest daughter had been evacuated to relatives in Hamburg. Greta had developed a persistent cough that worsened over several days. James noticed her growing weakness and realized she was developing pneumonia. The camp medical officer, overwhelmed with cases and frankly not particularly concerned about the health of German prisoners, dismissed James's concerns. So James took matters into his own hands. He found a doctor in a nearby displaced persons camp, traded a week's worth of cigarette rations for antibiotics, and personally ensured that Greta received the proper dosage at the right times. He checked on her every morning and evening, bringing her extra portions of soup from his own meals. Within 10 days, she had recovered. She never forgot that he had quite possibly saved her life. There was also the incident with young Liesl Braun, barely 19 years old, who had a complete emotional breakdown one evening. The accumulated stress, fear, and grief overwhelmed her, and she curled into a ball in the corner of the barracks, sobbing uncontrollably and speaking incoherently. Some of the other women tried to comfort her, but she was beyond reach. James heard the commotion and came to investigate. He could have simply filed a report and had her transferred to a psychiatric facility, washing his hands of the problem. Instead, he sat down on the floor near her, not touching her but speaking softly and steadily. He talked about the stars visible through the barracks window, about how they were the same stars that shone over America and Germany alike, about how the universe continued despite human conflicts. He spoke for nearly an hour, his voice calm and measured, until Liesl's breathing slowed and she gradually emerged from her crisis. Afterward, he arranged for her to have lighter duties and checked on her daily to ensure she was coping. One of the women, a former schoolteacher named Helga Weber, spoke functional English. She gradually became an informal liaison between James and the other prisoners. Through Helga, James learned their stories. He learned about Margaret, whose husband had been taken during the conflict and whose fate remained unknown. He learned about Anna, who had 3 children being cared for by elderly grandparents in a village that had been heavily affected during the final months of fighting. He learned about Sophie, who had lost her entire family when their city was struck during an air operation. As the weeks passed, something remarkable happened. The fear that had defined the women's initial attitude toward James transformed into trust and then into genuine respect. They began to understand that this black American soldier, who had every reason to harbor bitterness and anger, chose instead to demonstrate kindness and fairness. They began to recognize the profound irony of their situation. They had been taught to view people like James as inferior, as less than fully human. The propaganda they had absorbed had portrayed all non-European peoples as dangerous and uncivilized. Yet here was James, treating them with a dignity and consideration that contradicted everything their previous ideology had told them. He was patient when they made mistakes, fair when conflicts arose among them, and consistently respectful even when they were at their worst. The contrast between what they had been taught and what they were experiencing created a cognitive dissonance that forced many of them to reconsider beliefs they had held without question. Helga Weber, who had been a schoolteacher in Frankfurt before the auxiliaries, spoke functional English that she had learned during her university studies. She gradually became an informal liaison between James and the other prisoners. Through Helga, James learned their individual stories in greater detail than the brief conversations his limited German allowed. He learned about Margaret Fischer, whose husband had been in the infantry and whose fate remained unknown. She spent hours staring at the fence as if willing him to appear. Every night she recited his name like a prayer, clinging to hope despite the mounting evidence that few soldiers from his unit had survived the final defensive operations. James arranged for her to have access to the Red Cross Information Service, helping her fill out forms and navigate the bureaucracy of trying to locate missing persons. He learned about Anna Richter, who had 3 children being cared for by elderly grandparents in a small village near Dresden. The village had been heavily affected during the final months of the conflict, and Anna had no way of knowing if her children or parents had survived. The uncertainty was eating away at her, manifesting in sleepless nights and declining health. James wrote letters on her behalf to various relief organizations, using his position to add weight to her inquiries. When he finally received confirmation that her family had survived, he personally delivered the news to her. Anna collapsed in tears of relief, and James quietly stepped back to give her privacy with her emotions. The other women who witnessed this scene understood that James was not performing acts of kindness for recognition or approval. He did these things simply because he believed it was the right way to treat people. He learned about Sophie Zimmerman, who had lost her entire family when their city was struck during aerial operations. Her parents, younger brother and sister, had all perished. Sophie had survived only because she had been at her posting on that particular night. The guilt and grief she carried were overwhelming. She rarely spoke and moved through her days mechanically, performing her tasks with precision but without any sign of inner life. James recognized the symptoms of profound trauma. He did not try to force her to talk or to process her grief according to any particular timeline. Instead, he simply made sure she was cared for, that she ate enough, that she was not given tasks that would isolate her from the other women. Gradually, over weeks, Sophie began to emerge from her shell. One day she actually smiled at a joke one of the other women made. It was a small victory, but James noticed it and was glad. Through Helga's translations, the women also began to learn about James's own experiences. During quiet evenings, when his official duties were light and he had completed his rounds, James would sometimes sit on the steps of the barracks and talk with the women through the fence. These conversations started tentatively. The women were curious, but unsure if it was appropriate to ask questions of their guard. James, for his part, was initially hesitant to share personal information, but gradually a kind of informal dialogue developed. He told them about growing up in Laurel, Mississippi. He described the physical geography of the place, the pine forests and red clay soil, the humid summers and mild winters. But he also described the social geography, the invisible but rigid boundaries that separated black and white communities. He explained about the separate schools, where black children learned from outdated textbooks in buildings that were falling apart, while white children attended well-maintained schools with new materials. He described the separate water fountains, one marked for whites and one for coloreds, and how even as a child he understood the message those signs conveyed about his worth as a human being. He talked about the separate entrances to public buildings, how black citizens had to go around to the back door even when conducting legitimate business. He explained how his father had been beaten by local authorities for the offense of looking a white man directly in the eye. His father had been walking home from the fields where he worked, exhausted from a 12-hour day of labor. A white man on the sidewalk had spoken to him, and James's father, forgetting himself in his fatigue, had looked up and met the man's gaze while responding. 2 police officers happened to witness this exchange. They arrested James's father for insolence and took him to jail, where they beat him severely as punishment for his presumption. James had been 8 years old when this happened. He remembered his mother's face when his father finally came home 2 days later, bruised and barely able to walk. He remembered the fear and helplessness that filled their small house. He described other incidents. A childhood friend who had been taken from his home and never seen again, after being accused of whistling at a white woman. The friend had been 14 years old, and no one believed he had actually done anything wrong, but that did not matter. His disappearance served as a warning to the entire black community about the consequences of stepping out of line. James talked about the constant vigilance required just to survive, the mental exhaustion of always monitoring your behavior, your tone of voice, your posture, to avoid giving offense to white people who might punish you for perceived disrespect. The women listened in stunned silence. Many had believed the propaganda that portrayed America as a land of perfect freedom and opportunity, a place where everyone had equal rights and the chance to succeed based on merit alone. Learning the truth about racial conditions in the United States forced them to confront their own assumptions and prejudices. If America, the victor in this conflict, the nation that claimed to represent freedom and democracy, treated its own citizens with such systematic cruelty based purely on skin color, what did that say about the moral certainty of either side? How could they have been so completely wrong about so many fundamental things? Several of the women wept as they listened to James's stories. Helga later recalled that hearing about James's experiences was more effective at undermining their previous beliefs than any amount of political re-education could have been. The abstraction of ideology could be resisted or rationalized away, but the concrete reality of James's life and the quiet dignity with which he recounted his experiences made denial impossible. They had to confront the fact that they had participated in a system built on lies about human nature and human worth, and that those lies had not been unique to their own nation. But James also spoke about hope, and this was perhaps the most powerful part of his testimony. He talked about the black soldiers he served with, who believed that their service in this conflict would finally earn them the equality they deserved at home. He described the pride he felt when his unit performed well in combat, proving wrong all those who had said black soldiers could not or would not fight effectively. He spoke about the black officers who had risen through the ranks despite the obstacles placed in their way, demonstrating leadership and competence that could not be denied. He talked about his mother, who had finished only 4 years of formal schooling, but who read everything she could get her hands on, and who had taught him that education and self-improvement were forms of resistance against those who wanted to keep black people ignorant and powerless. He expressed his belief that change was possible, that the contradictions and injustices he had experienced would eventually give way to a better future. He acknowledged that change would not come easily or quickly, that there would be setbacks and continued resistance. But he believed in the long arc of history bending toward justice. He believed that the simple fact of his service and the service of hundreds of thousands of other black soldiers would make it impossible for America to maintain the fiction of black inferiority. How could the nation deny full citizenship to men who had fought and bled for it? The question would have to be answered, even if the answer took decades to fully manifest. One evening in late May, an incident occurred that revealed the depth of the relationship James had built with the women under his supervision, and that would have consequences extending far beyond that single night. It was approaching midnight when James, who slept in a small room adjacent to the main barracks to maintain security, was awakened by the sound of voices outside. He recognized immediately that something was wrong. The voices were male, American, and loud, with the false bravado that alcohol produces. He was on his feet and moving toward the door before his conscious mind had fully processed what he was hearing. Outside, 3 white soldiers from another unit stood near the entrance to the women's barracks. They were privates from a supply company, young men who had seen relatively little actual combat, but who had absorbed all the attitudes and prejudices of their upbringing and amplified them through military camaraderie and too much beer. The leader of the group, a corporal from Alabama named Jenkins, was fumbling with the latch on the barracks door. His companions were laughing and making crude comments about what they intended to do once inside. James stepped between them and the door. He was not a large man, standing 5 feet 9 inches tall and weighing perhaps 160 pounds. The 3 soldiers outweighed him collectively by at least 200 pounds. But James positioned himself squarely in the doorway and spoke in a calm but absolutely firm voice. He told them that they would not be entering the barracks. He explained that these were his prisoners under his supervision and that they would leave immediately or face serious consequences. The soldiers stared at him for a moment, processing the fact that a black soldier was telling them what to do. Then they laughed. Jenkins, swaying slightly from the alcohol, stepped closer to James and made a comment so vile that it will not be repeated here, a remark that invoked every racist stereotype and slur. He told James to step aside, or they would move him aside. He said that a black soldier had no business telling white men what they could or could not do, regardless of rank or duty. James did not move. He had faced this kind of hatred before, had heard these words or variations of them countless times throughout his life. He had learned early that responding with anger or violence would only provide justification for worse treatment. So he simply repeated, in the same calm voice, that they would not enter the barracks. He added that he had reported their presence to the officer of the watch, a lie, but one he hoped would make them reconsider. Jenkins, angered by James's refusal to be intimidated, reached out to shove James aside, but before his hand could make contact, something extraordinary happened. The door behind James opened, and women began emerging from the barracks. Not just a few, but dozens, then more than 100, until finally all 200 of them stood in the space between the barracks and the fence. They formed themselves into rows behind James, saying nothing. But their intent was absolutely clear. They were standing with their guard, their captor, against soldiers who wore the same uniform he wore. The sudden appearance of 200 women, many of them taller and heavier than the men who had threatened them, created an unexpected tableau. The drunken soldiers found themselves facing not a single black corporal whom they felt entitled to intimidate, but a mass of humanity united in solidarity. The women's faces showed determination and anger. Some had grabbed makeshift weapons, tools, or implements that could be used if necessary. The message was unmistakable. If these men wanted to enter the barracks, they would have to go through all of them. The confrontation lasted perhaps 2 minutes, though to James it felt much longer. The soldiers looked at the women, looked at James, and seemed to slowly realize that their intended crime had become impossible. Whatever they had planned to do, they could not do it in front of so many witnesses, could not overcome so much resistance. Jenkins spat on the ground near James's feet, a final gesture of contempt, and then turned and walked away. His companions followed, still muttering threats but clearly aware that the situation had turned against them. After they had gone, James turned to face the women. He had not asked for their help, had not expected it. He had been prepared to face the 3 men alone, knowing that calling for assistance would likely result in his being accused of overreacting or causing trouble. But the women had made their own choice. Helga stepped forward and spoke for the group. She said simply that they would not allow James to be harmed defending them. They understood what risks he was taking on their behalf every day, the delicate line he walked between his duty and the hostility of many of his fellow soldiers. They would not stand by and watch him be attacked. James nodded, unable to speak for a moment because of the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. These women, former enemies, people who just weeks ago had feared and perhaps despised him, had just risked their own safety to protect him. The irony and the beauty of that action struck him profoundly. He thanked them, his voice rough, and asked them to return to the barracks and try to get some rest. The next morning, James did report the incident to his commanding officer, Lieutenant Richard Carlson. Carlson listened to the account with a grim expression. He was one of the few white officers who had consistently treated his black soldiers fairly, and he recognized immediately the implications of what had occurred. He initiated an investigation, which was conducted with unusual speed and thoroughness. The 3 soldiers were identified, questioned, and found to have violated multiple regulations. They received disciplinary action that included reduction in rank, loss of pay, and transfer to different units. The punishment was relatively severe, more severe than such incidents usually merited, because Carlson understood that the integrity of the entire prison system depended on preventing such violations. But James knew that he had made enemies. The incident spread through the camp like wildfire, growing in the telling. Within days, every soldier in the facility had heard some version of the story. Among some, James's actions were respected. They recognized that he had done his duty and protected prisoners under his care. But among many others, particularly those who held deeply racist views, James's protection of German women was seen as a betrayal of racial loyalty. The fact that the German women had stood with a black man against white Americans was viewed as shameful and unnatural. Some soldiers said openly that James had gotten uppity, that he had forgotten his place. Others made threats, though these were generally vague and spoken when James was not present. The environment became more hostile. James found himself excluded from informal gatherings of soldiers. When he entered the mess hall, conversations would stop or shift to topics clearly intended to make him uncomfortable. Equipment he requested for his duties was delayed or denied. Small acts of sabotage occurred. Tools would go missing from his supply locker. Reports he filed would mysteriously disappear before reaching their destination. Nothing was overt enough to file a formal complaint, but the cumulative effect was isolating and stressful. Through it all, James maintained his professionalism and continued his work with the same dedication and integrity. He would not give his detractors the satisfaction of seeing him falter or fail. He would not allow their hatred to make him bitter or cruel. The women under his supervision understood what he was enduring on their behalf, and their respect for him deepened even further. They became more cooperative, more efficient in their work, as if trying to make his job easier in whatever small ways they could. Yet, James continued his work without changing his approach. He had been raised by a mother who taught him that dignity and integrity were internal qualities that could not be taken away by external circumstances. He had promised himself that he would never allow the hatred and discrimination he had experienced to turn him into someone who inflicted cruelty on others. As the weeks progressed and the summer of 1945 arrived, the prisoner processing camp gradually emptied. Women whose cases had been reviewed and who posed no security threat were being released to return to their homes or what remained of them. The process was slow and bureaucratic, but it moved forward steadily. James helped many of the women navigate the complicated paperwork required for release. He wrote letters on their behalf, vouching for their character. He used his connections with other soldiers to expedite cases when possible. When women were released without adequate supplies for their journey home, James pooled resources with sympathetic soldiers to provide them with food, basic medical supplies, and civilian clothing to replace their auxiliary uniforms. Helga Weber was among the last to be released in early July. Before she left, she spoke with James one final time. She thanked him for treating them with humanity when they had expected and perhaps deserved harshness. She told him that what he had shown them had changed her understanding of what it meant to be a good person. She said that she would never forget the Black American soldier who had proven through his actions that human dignity transcended nationality, race, and the circumstances of conflict. James watched her walk away through the camp gates, a small figure carrying a bundle of belongings, heading toward an uncertain future in a devastated Germany. He felt a complex mixture of emotions: satisfaction that he had done the right thing, sadness at the waste and suffering the conflict had caused for everyone involved, and anger at the realization that he would soon be returning to an America that would continue to treat him as inferior, despite his service. The 761st Tank Battalion was deactivated in the autumn of 1945. James returned to the United States in November, landing in New York Harbor, along with thousands of other soldiers being demobilized. The city celebrated the returning troops with parades and ceremonies, but these celebrations were largely segregated. Black soldiers marched in separate contingents and were often excluded from the festivities organized for white veterans. When James finally arrived back in Laurel, Mississippi, in December 1945, he discovered that little had changed. The same Jim Crow laws remained in force. The same discrimination governed every aspect of life. He could not eat at the lunch counter downtown. He could not use the public library. He could not register to vote without facing harassment and the threat of violence. He had hoped that his service, his honorable discharge, his decorations and commendations might earn him some measure of respect. But at the local store where he had worked before the conflict, the white manager told him that his old job had been filled and that he should look for work elsewhere. When he applied for a loan through a federal program designed to help veterans, he was turned away by the bank without explanation. The bitter irony was not lost on James. He had treated enemy prisoners with dignity and fairness. He had protected German women from harm. He had demonstrated the best qualities of American ideals abroad. And now, in his own hometown, he was denied the basic rights and opportunities that those same ideals supposedly guaranteed to all citizens. Other black veterans in Laurel and across the South faced similar experiences. They returned from overseas expecting that their service would have changed things, only to discover that the system of segregation and discrimination remained firmly in place. In some cases, the situation was even worse. White residents who felt threatened by black veterans who had tasted a measure of equality overseas sometimes responded with increased violence and intimidation. In February 1946, James decided to leave Mississippi. He packed his few belongings and traveled north to Detroit, Michigan, where wartime industrial expansion had created opportunities for black workers. The North had its own forms of discrimination, more subtle than the South but still pervasive, but at least there were jobs and a degree of freedom that Mississippi could not offer. In Detroit, James found work in an automobile factory. The pay was decent and the union, though not free from racial prejudice, at least officially protected workers regardless of color. He married in 1948 to a woman named Dorothy, who worked as a nurse at a hospital that served the black community. They raised 3 children in a modest home on the east side of the city. James rarely spoke about his experiences during the conflict, especially his time guarding the German prisoners. When his children asked him about the souvenirs and medals stored in a box in the closet, he would answer their questions briefly, and then change the subject. The memories were complicated. He was proud of his service and proud of how he had conducted himself. But the contrast between how he had been empowered to show humanity to former enemies and how he had been denied humanity in his own country remained a painful contradiction. In the 1960s, when the civil rights movement gathered momentum and began to dismantle the legal framework of segregation, James watched with cautious hope. He participated in local organizing efforts in Detroit, joining marches and attending meetings. He saw his oldest son graduate from college, something that would have been nearly impossible for a black student in Mississippi during his own youth. He saw his daughter become a teacher in an integrated school. Progress was happening, though more slowly and incompletely than he had hoped. Meanwhile, in Germany, the women James had guarded were rebuilding their lives in the new Federal Republic. Helga Weber became a teacher again, working in a school in Frankfurt. She married and raised a family. She never forgot Corporal James Mitchell and the kindness he had shown during those difficult weeks in the prisoner camp. In the 1970s, when interest in oral histories of the conflict began to grow, Helga was interviewed by a researcher studying the experiences of female auxiliaries. She spoke at length about James, describing how his treatment of the prisoners had challenged her preconceptions and changed her understanding of racial prejudice. The researcher was struck by the story and attempted to locate James to record his perspective as well. Finding James proved difficult. The military records listed him as having been discharged in November 1945, but provided no current address. The researcher eventually traced him to Detroit through veteran organization records. In 1976, 31 years after the events at the prisoner camp, the researcher contacted James and requested an interview. James was initially reluctant. He was in his mid-50s now, still working at the automobile factory, and he did not see why anyone would be interested in his experiences. But the researcher persisted, explaining that Helga had spoken about him and that the story deserved to be told. Finally, James agreed. The interview took place in James's living room over the course of several afternoons. He spoke carefully and thoughtfully about his childhood in Mississippi, his military service, and his time guarding the prisoners. He explained his philosophy that every person deserved to be treated with basic dignity, regardless of the circumstances. He acknowledged the irony that he had been able to show that dignity to enemy prisoners while being denied it himself in his own country. When asked if he felt angry or bitter about the way he had been treated, James paused for a long time before answering. He said that he had felt anger, of course, and that he still felt it sometimes when he thought about the injustices he had experienced. But he also said that he had made a conscious choice not to let that anger define him or control his actions. He had seen what hatred and prejudice did to people, both those who harbored it and those who were targeted by it. He had decided that he would live differently. The researcher asked James if he had ever heard from any of the women he had guarded. James said that he had received one letter in 1947 from Helga. She had written to thank him again and to tell him that she was teaching again and that she often thought about the lessons she had learned from him. The letter had been forwarded through multiple addresses before finally reaching him in Detroit. He had kept it, and he showed it to the researcher. The paper was yellowed and creased from being folded and unfolded many times over the years. The interview concluded with the researcher asking James what he hoped people would understand from his story. James thought about the question and then said that he hoped people would understand that the way you treat others, especially those who are powerless, reveals who you really are. He said that it would have been easy to be cruel to the German prisoners, to take out his anger and frustration on people who could not fight back, but that would have made him just like the people who had treated him cruelly. Instead, he had chosen to demonstrate the values that America claimed to represent, even when America itself failed to live up to those values. The oral history interview was eventually deposited in an archive, where it remained largely unnoticed for many years. James continued his life in Detroit. He retired from the factory in 1982 and spent his retirement years working in his garden, attending church, and spending time with his grandchildren. He passed away in 1993 at the age of 72, surrounded by his family. His obituary in the local Detroit newspaper was brief, mentioning his military service and his long career at the automobile factory, but saying nothing about the prisoner camp in Germany or the women he had guarded. To most people, he was simply another veteran, another working man who had lived a quiet and unremarkable life. But the story did not end there. In the early 2000s, as the generation that had fought in the conflict began to pass away and interest in preserving their stories intensified, researchers returned to the oral history archives. James's interview was rediscovered and began to attract attention. The contrast between his treatment of enemy prisoners and his own treatment as a Black American offered a powerful lens through which to examine the contradictions inherent in the American war effort. Historians began to contextualize James's story within the broader narrative of Black military service. They noted that over 1 million Black Americans had served in uniform during the conflict, often in segregated units and under discriminatory conditions. These soldiers had faced the complex task of fighting for freedom abroad while being denied full freedom at home. Some had used their military service as a platform to challenge segregation, while others had simply tried to survive and return home safely. James Mitchell represented a particular type of heroism that had been largely overlooked in traditional histories of the conflict. He had not won any famous engagements or made strategic decisions that changed the course of events, but he had maintained his humanity and integrity in circumstances that would have justified bitterness and cruelty. He had proven that dignity and decency could survive even the most dehumanizing systems. The German women he had guarded also represented a complicated aspect of the conflict's legacy. They had served the German military, contributing to a regime responsible for immense suffering and systematic atrocities. Yet they were also individuals caught in circumstances largely beyond their control, and they deserved to be treated humanely as prisoners. James had understood this complexity and had acted accordingly. In 2008, a documentary filmmaker learned about James's story through the archived interview. The filmmaker traveled to Germany and located several women who had been prisoners at the camp where James had served. Only a handful were still alive, now in their 80s and 90s, but their memories remained clear. They all remembered Corporal Mitchell. They remembered his kindness, his fairness, and the quiet dignity with which he had carried out his duties. One of the women, Anna Schneider, who had been 22 years old when James guarded her, spoke about how the experience had changed her life. She said that meeting James had been the first crack in the wall of prejudice that she had been raised with. She had been taught that people of different races were inferior, that they were to be feared or dismissed, but James had demonstrated through his actions that character and worth had nothing to do with skin color. She said that this lesson had stayed with her throughout her life and had influenced how she raised her own children and grandchildren. The documentary that resulted from this research brought wider attention to James's story. It was broadcast on public television and received positive reviews. Veterans groups invited surviving members of the 761st Tank Battalion to screenings. Civil rights organizations cited James's example in educational materials about the Black military experience. James's children and grandchildren, who had known only the basic outline of his military service, learned for the first time the full extent of what their father and grandfather had done and represented. They felt immense pride, mixed with sadness, that James himself had not lived to see his story recognized and honored. In 2010, the city of Detroit renamed a small park in James's neighborhood in his honor. A plaque was installed, describing his military service and his treatment of the German prisoners. The dedication ceremony was attended by city officials, veterans groups, and members of the German-American community. One of James's granddaughters spoke about what her grandfather had taught the family, about treating others with respect and dignity. The ceremony concluded with remarks from a representative of the German consulate, who acknowledged the complexity of the history but emphasized the universal value of James's example. The representative noted that James had embodied the best of what humanity could be, even in the worst of circumstances. Today, James Mitchell's story is taught in some schools as part of units on the Second World War and the Civil Rights Movement. His oral history interview is cited in academic papers about race, military service, and moral choice. His example is invoked in discussions about how individuals can maintain ethical behavior, even when the systems around them promote injustice. The women he guarded, most of whom have now passed away, left behind their own testimonies about the impact he had on their lives. Their accounts provide a unique perspective on the war's aftermath and on the possibility of human connection across the deepest divides. They challenge simplistic narratives about victors and vanquished, about good and evil, about who deserves compassion and who does not. James Mitchell's life illustrates a profound truth about moral courage. It is relatively easy to be kind to those who can benefit you or to those who are similar to you. It is much harder to extend kindness to those who have been your enemies or to maintain your principles when doing so brings no advantage and may even bring harm. James did the harder thing. He treated people the way they deserved to be treated as human beings, not because of what they had been or what they might do for him, but simply because it was right. The bitter irony of his story remains striking. A black soldier who had been systematically discriminated against throughout his life chose to demonstrate the values of equality and dignity that his own country professed, but failed to practice. Enemy prisoners received better treatment from him than he received from many of his fellow Americans. This contradiction reveals both the moral failure of racial discrimination and the strength of character that allowed James to rise above that failure. In the decades since the conflict ended, America has made significant progress toward racial equality, though much work remains. The segregation that defined James's youth is no longer legal, and black Americans have achieved positions of leadership and influence that would have been unthinkable in 1945. But the journey toward full equality is ongoing, and James's story serves as a reminder of how far the nation has come and how much further it needs to go. The relationship between moral behavior and systemic injustice is complex. James could not change the discriminatory system under which he lived. He could not force America to grant him the rights and respect he deserved. But he could control his own actions and choices. He could refuse to let systemic cruelty make him cruel. He could insist on treating others with the dignity he was denied. In doing so, he demonstrated a form of resistance that was quiet but profound. His story also raises questions about recognition and remembrance. For decades, James's actions were known only to those directly involved. He received no medals for his treatment of the prisoners, no public acknowledgement of his moral courage. He lived and died in relative obscurity. Only later, through the efforts of researchers and historians, did his story emerge. How many other stories of quiet heroism and moral integrity remain buried in archives or lost to time? How many other individuals made similar choices without recognition? The women James guarded went on to live full lives in post-war Germany. They experienced the economic recovery, the political transformation, and the cultural evolution of their country. Some of them spoke openly about their experiences during the conflict years, while others preferred to leave that period of their lives in the past. But those who remembered James and spoke about him consistently emphasized the same themes: his kindness, his fairness, and the powerful example he set. In the final analysis, James Mitchell's story is about the triumph of individual character over systemic injustice. It is about choosing to be decent when circumstances would have justified otherwise. It is about recognizing common humanity even across the lines of nation, race, and historical enmity. And it is about the quiet heroism of living according to your principles even when the world around you does not support or acknowledge those principles. His legacy lives on in the memory of those who knew him, in the historical record that has preserved his story, and in the example he set for future generations. He proved that one person, acting with integrity and compassion, can make a difference in the lives of others. He demonstrated that moral courage does not require grand gestures or public recognition. Sometimes it simply means treating people with the respect and dignity they deserve, regardless of the circumstances. James Mitchell was not a perfect man. He struggled with anger and frustration at the injustices he faced. He experienced doubt and weariness. He made mistakes and had regrets. But in that prisoner camp in Germany during the spring and summer of 1945, he made choices that revealed the best of what humans can be. He chose kindness over cruelty, dignity over degradation, and humanity over hatred. The German women he guarded never forgot him. His family cherishes his memory, and his story, once nearly lost to history, now stands as a testament to the power of individual moral choice in the face of systemic injustice. He could not change the society that discriminated against him, but he could and did change the lives of 200 women who had expected cruelty and instead found compassion. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.